What happened next became known throughout the galaxy as the Battle of Crying Stars. The human fleet didn't engage in the traditional space battle that the Vorthak expected. Instead, they implemented a strategy that shocked every alien observer and changed the rules of galactic warfare forever. Admiral Da-Yun Choi had studied the intelligence reports carefully. The Vorthak processing station wasn't just a military installation, it was a symbol of their power and cruelty. Destroying it would send a message that would echo across the galaxy. No matter how powerful the Empire thought it was, there were still those willing to fight back. The battle plan was unlike anything in the military databases of any known species. Instead of targeting the heavily defended command centers and weapons platforms, the humans went straight for the life support systems and prisoner containment areas. Their goal wasn't conquest or traditional victory. It was liberation at any cost. Captain Seung-Ho Lee commanded the first wave of berserker ships as they crashed through the station's defensive perimeter. His massive assault vessels had been designed specifically for this type of operation, combining the firepower of battleships with the boarding capability of troop transports. The Vorthak defenders were completely unprepared for the human tactics. They had expected a formal challenge followed by negotiations, and then perhaps a ceremonial battle with predetermined rules. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to have no concept of civilized warfare. The boarding actions began simultaneously at dozens of points around the massive station. Human Marines in powered armor smashed through airlocks, bulkheads, and defensive barriers with a violence that stunned the alien defenders. These weren't the careful, precise operations typical of galactic warfare. These were the savage assaults of a species bred for survival. On a death world, Lieutenant Colonel Yu Jin Nam led her Marines through the station's corridors like an avenging angel. Her troops moved with a coordination and aggression that the Vorthak had never encountered. Each Marine was a product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution on a planet where only the strongest and most adaptable survived. The alien defenders tried to follow their traditional military protocols, sending formal challenges and demanding that the humans identify themselves and state their intentions. But the human Marines had no interest in talking. They had come to free prisoners and kill slavers, and nothing was going to stop them. The first freed prisoners were the key to everything. Dr. Hye Jin-yoon worked frantically to provide medical aid while also gathering intelligence from beings who had been captive for years or even decades. These aliens knew the station's layout, understood Vorthak technology, and most importantly, they knew where the other prisoners were being held. Among the rescued aliens was a being called Nek 7, who had once been a military engineer for a species conquered by the Vorthak centuries ago. He looked at the human weapons and tactics with amazement and quickly offered to help guide the rescue teams through the station's most heavily defended areas. The liberated prisoners became humanity's greatest asset. Many were soldiers or civilians from advanced civilizations who had been waiting for years for a chance at revenge. They knew the station better than the Vorthak defenders, and they were eager to strike back against their captors. Commander In-Soo Park led a team of engineers through the station's technical sections, capturing Vorthak technology and data systems. What they discovered changed their understanding of the Empire forever. The Vorthak weren't just conquerors. They were parasites who had been living off the labor and creativity of enslaved species for so long they had forgotten how to innovate. The Vorthak technology was advanced but stagnant. It hadn't evolved or improved for centuries because the Empire's leaders saw no need for change. They controlled so much of the galaxy that they believed themselves invincible. This arrogance would prove to be their greatest weakness. The battle reached its peak when human forces breached the station's central core, where the most valuable prisoners were held. The Vorthak had concentrated their best troops here, expecting any attack to focus on this area. But by the time the humans reached the core, most of the station's defenses had already been destroyed. The prisoners in the core were not just individuals, they were entire cultural and scientific treasures. Scientists, philosophers, artists, and leaders from dozens of species who represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The Vorthak had been planning to extract this information through torture and experimentation. Dr. In-Soo Park worked desperately to establish communication with the rescued prisoners. Many spoke languages that had never been heard outside their home systems, but the universal translation systems developed from Kalani mathematics were proving remarkably effective. The most shocking discovery came when the rescue teams reached the station's research levels here. The Vorthak had been conducting experiments on captured beings trying to understand the biological and psychological factors that made different species useful as slaves. The research data revealed the true scope of Vorthak operations. They had detailed files on hundreds of species, including biological weaknesses, psychological profiles, and optimal methods for breaking their will to resist. The Empire had turned slavery into a precise science, but the files also contained something: unexpected detailed analyses of species that had successfully resisted Vorthak conquest. The Empire kept careful records of their failures, studying what had gone wrong and how to prevent future defeats. Admiral Choi studied these records with growing understanding. The Vorthak were not invincible. They were simply very good at picking fights they could win. They avoided deathworlds and aggressive species instead, focusing on peaceful civilizations that could be easily overwhelmed. This explained why they had never encountered serious resistance. Most intelligent species evolved on relatively safe worlds and developed peaceful societies that valued cooperation over conflict. When faced with Vorthak aggression, these species had little choice. But to surrender humanity was different. Earth was a Class 12 deathworld where survival required constant adaptation and the ability to fight against overwhelming odds. Humans had evolved not just intelligence but also the aggression and determination needed to never give up no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. The battle's turning point came when Admiral Choi made a decision that horrified the watching galaxy. She ordered the complete destruction of the processing station, along with all Vorthak personnel still aboard the massive installation, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of imperial power, would be wiped from existence. The human weapons systems had been designed for maximum destruction rather than surgical precision. When they focused their firepower on a single target, the results were devastating. Nuclear missiles, kinetic impactors, and energy weapons struck the station simultaneously, creating explosions that could be seen from neighboring star systems. HFY Vorthak tried desperately to evacuate their personnel, but the human attack was too fast and too overwhelming. Escape pods and transport ships were destroyed as quickly as they launched. The humans were making it clear that there would be no mercy. For slavers, Admiral Talvor managed to escape the destruction, but his entire understanding of galactic politics had been shattered. These Deathworlders from an unknown system had done something that should have been impossible. They had not only defeated Vorthak forces, but had completely annihilated a major Imperial installation. The station's AI systems broadcast a final message as the structure came apart. The analysis was simple and terrifying. These humans were not just another conquerable species. They were the kind of opponent the Empire had spent millennia avoiding. A species evolved for warfare on a world so dangerous that violence was part of their basic nature. The destruction continued for hours as secondary explosions tore through the massive station. Internal systems failed, power cores overloaded, and stored materials added to the devastation. By the time the explosions ended, nothing remained but scattered debris and the memory of what had once been a symbol of Vorthak power. In the aftermath, human rescue ships worked frantically to evacuate the freed prisoners. The logistics were overwhelming, with millions of beings from hundreds of different species requiring medical attention, food, and transportation. But the human fleet had prepared for exactly this situation. The rescued aliens looked at their human liberators with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Many had given up hope of ever being free, but these strange Deathworlders had traveled across the galaxy to fight for beings they had never met. Dr. Minho Kang collected as much Vorthak technology as possible from the wreckage, the weapons. News of the human victory spread across the galaxy faster than light-speed communication could carry it. The Vorthak Empire, which had remained unchallenged for millennia, had been dealt a devastating blow by an unknown species from the Galactic Rim. Alien civilizations that had accepted Vorthak dominance as a fact of life suddenly began to whisper about rebellion. On the water world of Aquanis, Elder Naya called together the surviving members of her species' council. The Aquani had been one of the first civilizations conquered by the Vorthak. their peaceful nature making them ideal slaves for underwater mining operations. But the human broadcast, transmitted across all frequencies, gave them something they hadn't felt in centuries: hope. The broadcast featured Commander Dong Hyun-shin speaking directly to the camera, his scarred face and battle-worn armor making him look like something from an ancient war legend. His words were simple but powerful. Humanity would not stop with one victory. They would continue fighting until every slave was free and every slaver was dead. Dr. Yoonji Choi, now serving as humanity's first xenobiologist, worked frantically to establish communication protocols with the dozens of alien species they had rescued. Each species brought new intelligence about Vorthak operations, slave routes, and military installations. A picture emerged of an empire built on systematic cruelty, spanning multiple galaxies and controlling billions of enslaved beings. The political implications were staggering. Ambassador Kyung-min Yu, humanity's first interstellar diplomat, found herself negotiating with alien governments that had never imagined resistance was possible. Some species offered alliance and support. Others, terrified of Vorthak retaliation, begged humanity to stay away from their systems. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source: the Builders, an ancient robotic civilization that had remained neutral for millions of years, sent a message to the human fleet. They had been watching the galaxy stagnate under Vorthak rule, waiting for someone with the strength and will to break the cycle of oppression. That someone, they declared, was humanity. The Builders' offer was unprecedented. They would share technology and provide logistical support for humanity's war against the Vorthak Empire. In exchange, they asked only that humans continue to fight for freedom throughout the galaxy. It was an offer that would transform humanity from a single system species into a galactic superpower overnight. The space around Neptune had never seen anything like it. Admiral Daeun Choi stood on the observation deck of her flagship, watching as hundreds of ships arrived from every corner of human space. The assembly point was far enough from Earth to avoid panic, but close enough for rapid deployment when the fleet was ready. Every shipyard in human territory was working around the clock to prepare vessels for the mission. Military ships were being upgraded with the latest weapons and armor, while civilian cargo vessels were being converted into troop transports and supply ships. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in human history. Commander Jae-hoon Oh checked his watch for the 10th time in an hour as another wave of transport ships arrived. His job was coordinating the arrival and processing of personnel, and the numbers were staggering. Over 2 million humans had volunteered for the mission when the government had quietly put out the call for volunteers. The volunteers came from every walk of life. Former military personnel who couldn't resist the call to action, space miners who had fought pirates in the asteroid belts, colonists from frontier worlds who had experience fighting dangerous alien creatures, scientists who wanted to study alien technology up close, even reformed criminals who saw this as a chance for redemption. Jae-hoon had expected maybe a few thousand volunteers, but the response had been overwhelming. It seemed like everyone wanted to be part of humanity's first interstellar war. The problem was that they could only take the best. The journey to Kalani space would take months, and they couldn't afford to bring anyone who wasn't absolutely committed to the mission. The selection process had been brutal. Physical fitness tests, psychological evaluations, combat simulations, and technical assessments. Only the top 10% of volunteers made it through the screening process. But even that meant they had more qualified personnel than they had ever dreamed of. Dr. Min Ho Kang was working 18-hour days in the weapons development labs, trying to prepare humanity's arsenal for alien warfare. The challenge was that they had no idea what they would be facing. The Kalani had provided some information about Vorthak technology, but there were huge gaps in their knowledge. The biggest advantage humans had was that their weapons were designed for use on a death world. Everything from small arms to ship weapons had been built to deal with the most dangerous situations imaginable. Earth's history of constant warfare had produced weapons that were incredibly efficient at killing things quickly. Dr. Kang's team had been working on modifications to existing weapons based on the Kalani intelligence. They had learned that most alien species were physically weaker than humans and their armor was designed to stop energy weapons rather than kinetic projectiles. This gave humanity a significant advantage since human weapons relied heavily on solid projectiles moving at high speed. The new Berserker-class ships were the crown jewel of the human fleet. These vessels had been designed specifically for this mission, combining the firepower of a battleship with the boarding capability of an assault transport. Each Berserker carried 1,000 Marines in powered armor, along with enough weapons and supplies to fight extended battles. Lieutenant Colonel Yu Jin Nam was responsible for training the Marine battalions that would be deployed from the Berserker ships. Her job was to take volunteers from dozens of different backgrounds and turn them into a unified fighting force capable of operating in alien environments. The training was intense and realistic. The Marines practiced boarding actions on mock-ups of alien ships designed from Kalani intelligence. They learned to fight in zero-gravity, low-gravity, and high-gravity environments. They studied alien anatomy and psychology to better understand their enemies. But Yu Jin knew that no amount of training could fully prepare her Marines for what they would face. The Vorthak had been conquering other species for thousands of years. They had experienced weapons and tactics that humanity could only guess at. The Marines would have to rely on their natural advantages, speed, aggression, and adaptability. The most challenging part of the preparation was the psychological aspect. Many of the volunteers had never left the solar system, let alone fought in an interstellar, where they would be facing enemies that looked nothing like humans in environments they had never seen before. Yu Jin made sure every Marine understood what they were fighting for. This wasn't just a military mission, it was a rescue operation. The processing station they were targeting held millions of enslaved beings from hundreds of different species. Every day they delayed meant more suffering for the prisoners. The technical preparations were just as complex as the military ones. Dr. Yun-Soo Park had been tasked with developing communication systems that could work with alien technology. The Kalani had provided some basic information about galactic communication protocols, but there were still many unknowns. The fleet would need to be able to communicate with freed prisoners, coordinate with potential alien allies, and gather intelligence about Vorthak operations. Dr. Park's team had developed universal translation systems based on the mathematical principles the Kalani had used. In their original message, Captain Won Seok Kim commanded the destroyer squadron that would serve as the fleet scouts and rapid response force. His ships were fast and heavily armed, designed to strike quickly and disappear before the enemy could respond. The destroyers would be responsible for gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations. The destroyer crews were some of the most experienced in human space. Many had served in the outer system patrol units that fought pirates and smugglers. They were used to operating independently and making quick decisions in dangerous situations, and the weeks passed, the fleet grew larger and more impressive. Over 3,000 ships of various sizes floated in formation around Neptune. From massive dreadnoughts that could level cities to small courier ships that could slip past enemy sensors undetected. The logistics of managing such a large fleet were staggering. Supply ships carried everything from ammunition and spare parts to food and medical supplies for a force of over 2 million people. Communication ships maintained contact between all units, and with Earth Command intelligence ships monitored alien communications and analyzed data from long-range sensors looking for any signs of Vorthak activity in human space. The paranoia was justified. If the Vorthak discovered what humanity was planning, they might launch a preemptive strike against Earth. Admiral Choi spent her days reviewing tactical plans and her nights worrying about everything that could go wrong. The mission was incredibly ambitious, attempting to rescue millions of aliens from a heavily defended installation using technology and tactics that had never been tested in real combat. But there was no choice. The Kalani message had made it clear that time was running out. The processing station was scheduled to be moved to a new location within the year, and the opportunity to strike would be lost. If humanity was going to act, they had to act. Now the breakthrough came when the first test of the new quantum drive systems proved successful. The drives would allow the fleet to travel to Kalani space in weeks rather than years, giving them the element of surprise they needed. Messages began arriving from Earth as families said goodbye to their loved ones. The mood was somber but determined. Everyone understood that this mission might be a one-way trip. but they also understood that it was necessary. The final briefing was held in the main hangar of Admiral Choi's flagship. Representatives from every unit in the fleet attended either in person or through video links. The Admiral's words were simple and direct. "We are not going to Kalani space as conquerors," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the massive space. "We are going as liberators. We will free the prisoners, fight the slavers, and show the galaxy that there are still those willing to stand up for what is right." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 2 million voices cheering and shouting their approval. The sound echoed through the hangar and across the communication channels, connecting the entire fleet. Within hours, the quantum drives began powering up across all 3,000 ships. The energy buildup was visible from Mars as space around Neptune began to glow with exotic particles and twisted spacetime. Admiral Choi gave the final order, and the human fleet vanished from the solar system, beginning their journey into the unknown. The largest military force in human history was now committed to a course of action that would either save millions of lives or lead to humanity's first major defeat in space. Back on Earth, people watched the news reports and wondered if they would ever see their loved ones again. The fleet was traveling to a part of the galaxy that no human had ever seen to fight enemies they knew almost nothing about. But there was also pride in the watching crowds. Humanity was finally taking its place among the stars, not as peaceful explorers, but as warriors fighting for justice and freedom. The signal from the dying Kalani had awakened something in the human spirit that had been sleeping since the end of the last wars on Earth. The age of human expansion into the galaxy had begun, and it would be written in fire and blood as humanity fought to free the enslaved and punish the enslavers. The Deathworld species was about to show the galaxy what they were capable of when pushed to action. The human fleet emerged from quantum space expecting to find empty void and a hidden refugee camp. Instead, they found themselves staring at the most massive artificial structure any of them had ever seen. The Vorthak processing station was the size of a small moon, surrounded by defensive platforms and swarming with alien ships. Admiral Dai-Yun Choi stood on her command bridge, studying the tactical displays with growing anger. The intelligence from the Kalani had been accurate but incomplete. The Vorthak had found the Kalani hideout and built their installation directly on top of it. What had once been a refuge for the last survivors of a dying species was now a factory for processing slaves. The station itself was a nightmare of twisted metal and pulsing energy conduits. Massive docking bays received a constant stream of transport ships, each one carrying cargo containers filled with living beings. Scanner readings showed that the station held over 10 million prisoners from hundreds of different species. Commander Sung-Ho Park monitored the long-range sensors as his team analyzed the enemy forces. The Vorthak had nearly 500 ships patrolling the area, ranging from small patrol craft to massive battleships that dwarfed anything in human space. Their technology was clearly more advanced than humanity's, but there was something strange about their deployment patterns. The alien ships moved in perfect formations following predictable patrol routes. Their behavior suggested a military that had never faced serious resistance. Every movement was precise and ceremonial, as if they were performing a parade rather than defending a military installation. Captain Won Seok Kim commanded the destroyer squadron positioned on the edge of the system, watching the enemy patrol patterns. His experienced eye noticed something that made him smile grimly. The Vorthak ships were beautiful, elegant vessels designed more for intimidation than practical warfare. Their hulls gleamed with decorative elements that served no tactical purpose. This gave him an idea. The enemy clearly valued appearance over function, which meant they probably underestimated any species that didn't follow their aesthetic preferences. Human ships were ugly utilitarian vessels built for maximum effectiveness rather than beauty. This might work in their favor. The first contact with the enemy came when a Vorthak patrol discovered the human fleet. 3 sleek cruisers approached the humans, broadcasting messages in dozens of alien languages. The translations were arrogant demands for immediate surrender, combined with threats about the consequences of resisting the Empire. The Vorthak messages revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what they were facing. They referred to the humans as primitive barbarians who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve a superior civilization. They offered to accept surrender and promised that human slaves would be treated well if they cooperated. Admiral Choi listened to the alien demands with growing rage. These creatures had enslaved entire galaxies, and now they expected humanity to simply give up without a fight. They had clearly never encountered a species that refused to bow down to their supposed superiority. The human response was not what the Vorthak expected. Instead of surrender negotiations or even defiance, the human fleet simply ignored the alien demands completely. The three cruisers waited for several minutes, broadcasting increasingly urgent messages before finally opening fire. The Vorthak weapons were impressive, painting space in brilliant colors as energy beams lanced out toward the human ships. But the attack was more show than substance, designed to demoralize enemies rather than destroy them. The alien weapons were built to disable ships and capture crews alive for processing into slaves. The human response was immediate, devastating, and completely unexpected. Captain Kim's destroyer squadron opened fire, with kinetic weapons accelerating tungsten rods to tremendous speeds. The projectiles moved so fast they were invisible until they struck their targets. The Vorthak shields were sophisticated energy barriers designed to deflect the most advanced alien weapons in the galaxy. But they were completely useless against solid objects moving at near light speed. The tungsten rods passed through the shields as if they weren't there and punched through the alien hulls with devastating effect. All three Vorthak cruisers were destroyed in the first salvo, their beautiful hulls torn apart by kinetic impacts that released the energy of nuclear weapons. The explosions lit up space like miniature stars visible from the main processing station alarm. Signals began screaming across the Vorthak installation as they realized they were under attack. Admiral Talvor, the station commander, had ruled this sector for 2 centuries without facing any serious resistance. He commanded over 500 warships and weapons capable of destroying entire planets. But as he watched the human fleet spread out in attack formation, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: fear. These newcomers weren't following any of the established patterns of galactic warfare. They had destroyed 3 Imperial cruisers without any attempt at negotiation or posturing. The tactical displays showed that the human fleet was moving in ways that made no sense to Vorthak military doctrine. Instead of forming up for a traditional fleet engagement, they were scattering into smaller groups, moving at high speed toward different parts of the station. Dr. Min Ho Kang monitored the battle from his position on one of the command ships, analyzing the enemy responses to human tactics. The Vorthak were clearly more advanced technologically, but their military thinking seemed frozen in patterns that hadn't changed for centuries. The alien fleet moved slowly and predictably, following textbook formations that prioritized appearance and ceremony over tactical effectiveness. Their weapons were designed for capturing rather than destroying, which put them at a severe disadvantage against human forces that were built for maximum lethality. Commander Jae-hoon led the first wave of boarding ships toward the station's outer docking bays. The plan was to ignore the heavily defended military sections and go straight for the prisoner-holding areas. The Vorthak had never faced an enemy that prioritized rescue over conquest. The station's defensive systems opened fire as the human ships approached, but the weapons were designed to stop traditional attacks. The Vorthak expected enemies to approach, slowly giving time for negotiations and formal challenges. Instead, the humans came in fast and low, using the station's own structure to block defensive fire. Lieutenant Colonel Yu Jin Nam prepared her Marines for what would be humanity's first ground combat with alien forces. The intelligence suggested that most alien species were physically weaker than humans, but she warned her troops not to underestimate their enemies. The first boarding actions began at 17 different points around the massive station. Human Marines in powered armor smashed through airlocks and bulkheads, moving through the alien corridors like an unstoppable force. The Vorthak defenders had never seen anything like it. The aliens fought with elegant weapons that fired precise energy beams designed to disable rather than kill. Their tactics were formal and ritualized, following ancient patterns that emphasized honor and ceremony over effectiveness. This put them at a severe disadvantage against human Marines trained for close quarters. Combat Sergeant Kyungmin Lee led His squad threw the station's prisoner levels fighting past, shocked Vorthak guards who couldn't understand why these primitive aliens were so aggressive. The human soldiers showed no interest in following the established rules of galactic warfare, though. Liberated prisoners were the first aliens most of the Marines had ever seen. Beings with scales fur, multiple limbs, and stranger anatomies filled the holding cells. Some had been captive for generations, while others were recent arrivals still fighting against their restraints with desperate hope. Dr. Hyejin Yoon worked frantically to provide medical aid to the freed prisoners. Many were in terrible condition, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. The scale of the Vorthak crimes against sentient life was becoming clear, as rescue teams found more and more evidence of systematic cruelty. The battle reached its climax when Admiral Choi made a decision that sent shockwaves through the watching galaxy. Instead of trying to capture the station, she ordered its complete destruction. The massive installation, home to thousands of Vorthak personnel, was targeted by every heavy weapon in the human fleet. The Vorthak had monitored the entire battle, analyzing human tactics and behavior. Their conclusion, transmitted across their empire, was both simple and terrifying. These newcomers weren't just another conquerable species. They were Deathworlders, evolved on a planet so dangerous that violence and aggression were encoded. In their very DNA, the station's destruction was visible from several star systems away, as concentrated human firepower tore apart the massive structure. The explosions continued for hours, as secondary systems and stored materials added to the devastation. The aftermath of the battle, human rescue ships worked to evacuate the millions of freed prisoners. The logistics were staggering, but the human fleet had come prepared with transport capacity and medical facilities for exactly this situation. Admiral Talvor survived the destruction of his station, but his entire worldview had been shattered. These primitive barbarians from the Galactic Rim had destroyed a facility that had stood for centuries. They had shown no interest in negotiation, conquest, or following any of the established rules of warfare. The implications were staggering. The Vorthak Empire had built its power on the assumption that all. Dr. Hyun-Woo Kim rubbed his tired eyes and stared at the computer screens in front of him. The numbers and patterns dancing across the displays made no sense at all. He had been working for 18 hours straight in the Deep Space Research Lab, on New Sol Station, trying to figure out what was causing the strange signals his equipment kept picking up. The lab was quiet, except for the soft humming of machines and the distant sound of air recyclers working to keep the station livable. Hyun-Woo was alone on the night shift, which was exactly how he liked it. No distractions, no interruptions, just him and the mysteries of deep space. For 3 weeks now, his sensors had been detecting something unusual coming from beyond their galaxy. The signals were faint, but they followed a pattern that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. At first he thought it might be interference from the station's power systems or maybe solar radiation from their star. But every test he ran proved that the signals were coming from somewhere far, far away. Hyun-Woo took another sip of his cold coffee and adjusted the sensitivity on his main receiver. The signal strength jumped, and suddenly the pattern became much clearer. His heart started beating faster as he realized what he was looking at. The signals weren't random noise from space. They were organized, structured, mathematical. He called up his analysis programs and started running the data through every pattern recognition system the station had. The results made him stand up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. The signals contained prime number sequences, geometric progressions, and mathematical constants that any intelligent species would recognize. This wasn't natural phenomena. This was communication. His hands shook as he reached for the emergency communication panel. Dr. So-Young Park lived in the residential section of the station, and she wouldn't appreciate being woken up in the middle of the night cycle. But this discovery was too important to wait until morning. The communication screen flickered to life, showing So-Young's sleepy face. Her long black hair was messy, and she looked annoyed until she saw the expression on Hyun-Woo's face. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up straighter in her bed. "Is there an emergency?" Hyun-Woo couldn't find the right words to explain what he had discovered. Instead, he just said, "You need to get down to the lab right now. Bring your xenolinguistics equipment, all of it." So-Young was one of the best language experts in human space. She had spent years developing systems that could theoretically decode alien languages, if humans ever encountered any. Her work had always been considered interesting, but not particularly useful since no one had ever found proof of alien intelligence. 20 minutes later, So-Young burst into the lab still wearing her pajamas and carrying 3 cases full of specialized computer equipment. She took one look at Hyunwoo's screens, and her annoyed expression changed to amazement. "This is incredible," she whispered as she watched the mathematical patterns flowing across the displays. "Where is this coming from?" Hyunwoo pointed to a star chart on another screen. "The signals are coming from here, beyond the Andromeda Galaxy and empty space between galactic clusters. Whoever is sending this message is very, very far away." So-Young set up her equipment and began connecting it to Hyunwoo's receivers. Within an hour, she had confirmed what he suspected. The signals contained layers of information embedded in the mathematical framework. Basic concepts like numbers and geometric shapes were used as a foundation for more complex ideas. As the hours passed, the 2 scientists began to decode more and more of the message. The senders had been very clever in how they structured their communication. They started with simple universal truths that any intelligent species would understand, and gradually built up to more complex concepts. The breakthrough came just before dawn. Young had been working on a section of the signal that seemed to repeat in different variations when she suddenly gasped and pointed at her screen. "Hyunwoo, this section here, it's a star map," she said excitedly. "Look at these coordinates and reference points. This is showing the location of star systems, but that's not all." Hyunwoo replied as he pulled up another section of decoded data. "This part contains technical specifications, blueprints for some kind of technology. I think it's their power systems and maybe weapons." The 2 scientists worked frantically to decode more of the message. As the picture became clearer, they realized they weren't just looking at a random transmission from an alien civilization. This was a distress call. The message told a story of a species called the Kalani, who had been fleeing across the galaxy for generations. They were the last survivors of their homeworld, which had been destroyed by something called the Vorthak Empire. The Kalani had been hiding in the empty space between galaxies, slowly dying as their ancient ships failed one by one. This message was their final desperate attempt to contact anyone who might be listening. They had included everything they thought might be useful: their history, their technology, their knowledge of the Vorthak Empire, and most importantly, detailed information about Vorthak, military installations, and weaknesses. But the most shocking part of the message was what it revealed about the Vorthak Empire. This wasn't just one aggressive alien species. The Empire was a massive confederation that had been conquering and enslaving entire civilizations across multiple galaxies for thousands of years. They had destroyed countless species and turned billions of beings into slaves. The Kalani message included coordinates to a facility they called a processing station, where the Vorthak kept millions of captured beings from hundreds of different species. The Kalani estimated that there were thousands of such facilities scattered across Vorthak space. Hyunwoo and So-Young sat in stunned silence as they realized the implications of what they had discovered. Humanity had always wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they knew the answer, and it was more terrible than anyone had imagined. The universe was full of intelligent life, but most of it was enslaved by a cruel empire that saw other species as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The Kalani had provided detailed star charts showing the extent of Vorthak territory. It covered most of several galaxies and was slowly expanding toward the Milky Way. So-Young was the first to break the silence. "We have to report this to Earth Command," she said quietly. "They need to know what's coming." Hyunwoo nodded, but he was already thinking beyond just reporting the discovery. The Kalani had sent more than just information. They had sent a plea for help. They were dying alone in the void between galaxies while millions of other beings suffered in Vorthak slave camps. Within hours of sending their report to Earth, the communication channels between New Sol Station and Earth Command were buzzing with activity. The implications of the discovery were staggering. Not only had humanity made first contact with alien intelligence, But they had learned that a massive hostile empire was slowly expanding toward their part of the galaxy. Captain Taman Lee of the Earth Defense Force was one of the first military officers to read the complete decoded message. He had spent his entire career preparing for the theoretical possibility of alien contact, but nothing had prepared him for this reality. The Kalani message painted a picture of the Vorthak Empire that made Captain Lee's blood run cold. This wasn't just a militaristic civilization that happened to be aggressive. The Vorthak had built their entire society around the systematic enslavement and exploitation of other species. They saw themselves as the rightful rulers of the universe and viewed all other intelligent life as inferior beings that existed only to serve them. But what made the message even more disturbing was the intelligence it provided about Vorthak expansion patterns. The Empire had been growing steadily for millennia, conquering roughly one new galaxy every 1,000 years. At their current rate of expansion, they would reach the outer edges of the Milky Way within the next 500 years. Captain Lee realized that humanity had been given an incredible gift. The Kalani had provided detailed information about Vorthak technology, military tactics, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The Empire had become complacent after thousands of years of easy victories. They had never faced serious resistance from any of the species they encountered. The captain immediately began drafting recommendations for Earth Command. This was more than just a first contact situation. This was an opportunity to strike a blow against an evil empire while potentially saving millions of enslaved beings. The Kalani had provided coordinates to their processing station, along with intelligence about its defenses and weaknesses. Within 48 hours of the discovery, every major government on Earth had been briefed on the situation. The debates were intense and heated. Some leaders argued that humanity should focus on defending their own territory and avoid getting involved in alien conflicts. Others insisted that humanity had a moral obligation to help the enslaved species. The deciding factor came when xenobiologists analyzed the Kalani data about human evolution. The message included scans that the Kalani had somehow obtained of Earth and humanity. The Kalani identified humans as what they called Deathworlders, a species that had evolved on an extremely dangerous planet. According to Kalani analysis, most intelligent species in the galaxy had evolved on relatively peaceful worlds with stable climates and few natural threats. Humans were unusual because Earth was what the Kalani classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so dangerous that only the most adaptable and aggressive SP. 6 months after the first human victory, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. What started as a rescue mission had evolved into a full-scale galactic war, with battle lines drawn between the ancient Vorthak Empire and a growing coalition of free species led by humanity. General Woojin Kim, promoted to lead the new Galactic Liberation Army, studied tactical displays showing the scope of their conflict. The war was being fought on 1,000 fronts across dozens of star systems. Human fleets, supported by alien allies and builder technology, were striking at Vorthak installations throughout their territory. The enemy had adapted to human tactics, but their fundamental weaknesses remained. Vorthak society was built on the assumption of superiority over all other species. When that assumption was shattered, their entire military doctrine collapsed. They couldn't understand how primitive Deathworlders could consistently outfight their technologically superior forces. Captain Sora Kwan led the most daring mission of the war, a direct assault on the Vorthak capital world. Her fleet of stealth ships penetrated deep into enemy territory, gathering intelligence on the Empire's leadership structure. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The Vorthak Empire was fracturing, with different factions fighting among themselves, but they still controlled enough firepower to destroy entire star systems. The war's turning point came when Dr. Sang-Min Park, working with builder scientists, developed a weapon that could disable Vorthak technology without harming organic life. The liberation of entire worlds became possible without the massive casualties that had marked earlier battles. Freed populations joined the coalition eagerly, bringing fresh troops and local knowledge to the fight. But humanity's greatest achievement wasn't military. It was the example they set for the galaxy. Species that had been enemies for millennia began working together against their common oppressor. The concept of freedom, once limited to a few enlightened civilizations, spread like wildfire through formerly enslaved populations. As Admiral Choi stood on her flagship's observation deck, watching a newly liberated world celebrate its freedom, she reflected on how far humanity had come. They had left Earth as a single species seeking to help strangers in distress. Now they were leading a galactic revolution that would reshape civilization itself. The signal that had brought the human fleet across the stars had carried more than just a cry for help. It had carried the seeds of freedom, planted in soil prepared by countless generations of suffering beings who had never stopped hoping for liberation. And humanity, the Deathworlders from the Galactic Rim, had proven worthy of that hope. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The age of the Vorthak Empire was ending, and the age of galactic freedom was about to begin.